Warning: this video contains some actions that may not be safe. Please be cautious, and we claim no responsibility for any injuries obtained from building this device.
Hey guys, in this video we're going to show you how to make a super cool Micro FPV rig here. This will allow you to basically mount FPV on pretty much any of your RC vehicles because it's so light. It's also extremely cheap and fun to build. So let's get started. Okay, for the first step, you're going to gather your parts. The link to purchase all these parts is available in the description below. You're going to need a wide-angle mini CCTV video camera here. This one happens to be 600 TVL. You're going to need safety glasses, a 3-setting dip switch here, so it's got 3 mini switches in this little assembly here. A micro video transmitter here. This one happens to be 200 milliwatts, although you can go from 25 all the way up to 200. Doesn't really matter. I would suggest 200 though. Going to need a micro FPV antenna. This one happens to be a little bit heavy, but it's totally worth it because it's a really nice one. It's one of these cloverleaf ones, which is really good. Gonna need one of these little connectors. I'm not quite sure what they're called because they have a really crazy long weird name, but this will be used to connect to your SkiSky flight controller if you happen to be using one, so you can get power to your FPV. If you don't use this and get power from your SkiSky board, you'll get lines across your screen because of the power isn't filtered, and that is very bad because you can't really see too well. You're going to need a male and female low-C connector. Gonna need a high-precision cordless soldering iron. I am loving this thing. It's awesome. You can do super high-precision soldering with it, and it heats up pretty quick. Gonna need some form of pick tool to scratch up the surface of your video transmitter so that you can solder on a dip switch. You're gonna need a helping hand / third hand. This is a necessity for this because you will not be able to do this while holding it yourself. You're going to need a small bit of tape. You're going to need some solder. Make sure this is rosin core. You're going to need some wire snips. You need some wire strippers. You're going to need a hot glue gun. This one's great. It's giant. It's 100 watts and it uses 11mm glue sticks, which are... You're going to also need a soldering sponge. I'm just using a dish sponge for this because they're cheaper. If you'd like though, you may use a professional soldering sponge. You may also need a higher power soldering iron depending on the wattage of your handheld cordless soldering iron. This one's really nice because it at least has a semi-fine tip. Okay, now that we got our parts, let's get started. Okay, for the second step, what we're going to be doing is installing our dip switch here onto our Micro FPV transmitter. So to do this, what you're going to do is take one side of the pins on your dip switch and bend them flat, just like that. This will be so it can rest flat on the top of your FPV transmitter because this metal plate is grounded, and all 3 of these are going to need to be soldered to that. So if you look on your Micro FPV transmitter here, there's actually labeling in small silver lettering. And at the bottom here, it says channel 1, 2, and 3. So that is the bottom 3 connectors here. That is right next to the model number. The model number here kind of points to the bottom because that's always at the bottom. And so the dip switch is going to be soldered like that. So all 3 of the dip switch wires on one side are going to touch here, here, and here on the video transmitter. And if you look at that on top, it kind of looks like that. So all three of the other side of the dip switch is going to be touching this top plate here. We are going to solder that up. But before we can solder it, what we're going to need to do is take our scraper tool here and scratch up the surface of our video transmitter. You can also use steel wool. This is just what I happen to have. This will help you solder it on, because if you don't do this, the solder will have trouble sticking. Make sure to scratch it up real well, but not damage it. Just like that. That seems scratched enough. Okay, now it's time to solder on your dip switch. Make sure you're wearing your safety glasses for this, and you're in a at least semi-ventilated room, because you don't want to suffocate from solder fumes. So what you're going to do first is take a small piece of your masking tape, take your dip switch, make sure it's in the right place here. So 3 connectors on one side are touching the video transmitter, and 3 on the other are touching the top plate, just like that. And that should be on the bottom where it is labeled channel 1, 2, and 3. And then you're going to tape this in place. And then you're going to stick that in your third hand. We're going to be soldering the 3 wires that connect your video transmitter first. There you go. Now you want to heat up your soldering iron and solder that up. Some people claim that tinning the wires on your video transmitter is a necessity before you solder them, but I just find that extra solder just gets in the way, so I'm just going to solder them without tinning them. So for this, what you're going to do is heat up a small dot on your soldering iron, and then what you're going to do is just kind of tap it onto each one, and surface tension, you kind of suck it onto that connection. Okay, just like that. Now you can unclip it. So now what we're going to do is add a generous heaping of solder across these 3 connections here that connect to the top plate here of the video transmitter. So for that, we're just going to add a little bit of tape in the corner here, just so that we don't screw up our video transmitter and accidentally crush it and mess it up with the alligator clip here. Put it in place just like that and solder it up. When you're done soldering on your dip switch, it should look something like this. Okay guys, now it is time to install your antenna. But before we can do this, we're gonna have to trim our antenna. So it doesn't really matter which length you trim it to, just make sure it fits your application. So I'm going to trim off about 1.5 inches for mine. When you do this, make sure that you account for that you're gonna have to strip off about 1/4 inch here so that you can connect it to your video transmitter. So you wanna snip off the end here. Set this scrap aside. What you're going to want to do is get your wire strippers and find the setting where it will just barely strip off the outer plastic layer. There we go, just like that. Now you're going to want to take this and pull it into 2 spikes here on either side. So there we go. It should look kind of like that. And then in the center piece here, you're going to take your wire strippers and strip off a little bit of that plastic, but not enough, so that you'll have a little bit of space here so that your little legs here don't touch the centerpiece. There we go. Just like that. Now that your antenna is prepped, it's time to tin that and get it ready for installation. Okay, now you can tin the wires on your antenna here. So for this, you're going to clip your antenna in your third hand. And what you're going to do is take your soldering iron, heat up a little ball of solder, and then run that along each of the wires here of your antenna. Make sure that they're evenly coated and that you don't have any massive balls of solder on them. And then once we're done with this, we can mount it onto our video transmitter. Okay, once you're done tinning your wires, they should look just like this. And then now that we're done with that, we can move on to soldering that up to our video transmitter. Okay, so I've clipped our antenna and our video transmitter here into our third hand, and I've aligned it so that the 2 outer legs of our antenna touch the ground labeling on our video transmitter, and the center part of our antenna touches the ant labeling on our video transmitter. So what we're going to do is we're going to just add a small dab of solder to each of these, making sure that they don't short, and then we'll have our antenna mounted. So let's get started. There you go. go. Now that you're done soldering up your antenna, you can take your wire snips here and trim off any excess wire. Don't trim this too short though, because you could weaken your solder joints. Just like that. And now we need to move on to the next step. Okay guys, for this step what we're going to be doing is installing our camera and wiring up our power for our video transmitter and our camera. Right now what we're going to want to do is trim our cable running off of our camera here. You want to trim this to whatever length you really want your camera at. For example, you could trim it at the very end if you want your video transmitter off to the side and then your camera over in the front. Or you could trim it around 1 inch if you want your camera to mount on top of your video transmitter. So I'm going to trim it at about 3/4 of an inch because I want it to mount on top of my video transmitter. Before you cut your wires, make sure to remember that you're going to need to strip them, and that's going to take off a little bit of your wire length. So always cut it a little bit longer than you think you're going to need. There you go, just like that. Now you can set your camera wire scraps here off to the side. And now what we're going to do is take our wire strippers and take our female loci, and what we're going to do is first of all trim our female loci down to around 1 inch here, so somewhere around that. Throw those wire scraps away, and then take our wire strippers and strip off a little bit of wire here. There you go, just like that. Now what we're going to want to do is strip off a little bit off the end of each of these camera wires here. For this, I'm not actually going to use my wire strippers because I can't strip a wire this skinny. This looks like it's probably around like 30 gauge wire, which is really skinny stuff. So for this, I'm actually going to use my teeth. Make sure never to use your teeth for thicker wire that's really below like 20 gauge, but for this it's so skinny it can't really damage my teeth. Okay, now that we're done stripping all of our wires and trimming them, what we can do is take the red wire running off of our female loci and the red wire running off of our camera. We can twist them together because they will share the same positive. There we go, just like that. Now that you have that done, what you can do is take all the rest of your wires and twist the ends so that they're nice and twisted and they don't just unravel on you. Now that we have our wires twisted together, it's time to start soldering. For this, what you're going to need is your high precision soldering iron. And what you're going to want to solder first is just the little connection here where your camera positive and your loci positive connects. You're just going to want to run a small bead over that and just tin it and make sure it's nice and solid before we solder that up to our video transmitter. There we go, just like that. Now that we have these wires tinned, we can start soldering stuff up to our video transmitter. Okay, so now that we have all our parts clipped here on our third hand, we have our video transmitter here, and then we have our camera. Right now I'm going to be soldering the video connection, which is yellow on the camera, black is ground, white is audio, and red is voltage. The order that it goes in on the video transmitter is it's video, then audio, then ground for the camera, then voltage plus. This is where you're going to solder your red wire here that has both your camera's positive and your loci's positive, and then ground again, which is where battery ground is going to be. So we're just going to add a small dab of solder on each of these and solder them all up. Audio isn't really too necessary unless you're actually listening to it on headphones. If your audio wire breaks, this white one, don't even worry about it. You can even just cut it off. If you're really tight on weight, you can even cut off this little microphone down here. But I'm not going to worry about it. So I'm just going to solder this up real quick. Okay, now that we're done soldering our camera and power on, it should look just like this. And now that we're done with that, we can take some wire snips and just trim off any excess wire that's hanging out. Make sure to be careful though, because you don't want to dislodge any of your wires. Okay guys, now that you have your camera and your power soldered onto your video transmitter, it's time to glue this thing. It really depends on how you want your camera mounted and the purpose of this FPV transmitter for you and how you're going to mount your camera. But for me, I'm actually going to hot glue my camera to the top of my video transmitter here, facing forward. But for you, if you'd like, you can mount it in some other way. So for me, what I'm going to do is bend these wires on the back of the camera actually forward here. And then cover them in hot glue so they don't break. And then once I'm done with that, I'm going to press that down and just glue it to the front. And I'm also going to cover the bottom here, all these connections, with hot glue to make sure they don't come loose either. Okay guys, now that you're pretty much done assembling your micro quad, it's time to do the extras. So this is basically just a small little lens cap, and this is a small piece of plastic that'll be used to support your antenna. The designs to both of these are available online on Thingiverse. They are .stl files, so if you happen to have a 3D printer, you can print them yourself for free. If you don't happen to have a 3D printer, we are actually selling them on eBay for as low as we possibly can. The reason why they'll probably be at a few dollars and this really costs us very little to make is because we have to pay for shipping, and that really sucks. So for this little plastic piece, what it's going to do is on your camera here, this rectangular part should slide over the top of your camera, and then the little hook here should be hanging out around near the antenna, just like that, and then your antenna should go over it and pop right in. And the function of this is so your antenna doesn't wobble around and take too much damage when you crash your quad, because I've noticed when I've been flying around that my antenna was starting to come loose here at the bottom because it was just banging all over the place when I crashed and stuff. So this little simple piece of plastic will fix it. And the lens cap is pretty self-explanatory. It just goes over the camera lens there, just so you don't get dirt in it, because your camera usually won't come with a lens cap. So yeah, now that you got all this stuff installed, it's time to mount this on our RC vehicle and try him out.